Good evening. The Bothell Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, September 17th will come to order. Let the record show that all members are present and accounted for, except for Commissioner Mike Stahl, who is absent and excused. Commissioner Gastineau, I have not heard from. I'm going to, at this point, assume that he's on his way, rather than making a call as to whether he's excused or unexcused. Moving forward in our agenda, are there any non-agenda public comments? Hearing none, no minutes to approve, no new business, and so we're going to launch right into a continuation of the public hearing that we've been conducting for most of 2014, and so we're going to continue the public hearing on our 2015 periodic plan and code update. And tonight's topic, as part of that periodic plan and code update, is the proposed code amendments regarding accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. And so at this point, we're going to turn the meeting and agenda over to Mr. Dave Boyd. Dave.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm going to turn it over almost immediately to Arthur Sullivan from Arch, who's done the lion's share of the work on this. But just by way of introduction, we're taking up this code amendment related to the housing element of the comprehensive plan. And this is one that was initiated by council, and in order to revisit some of the provisions for ADUs that have that we think have really discouraged the use of that as an option for housing in Bothell. So we presented a very high level overview previously, and tonight we're going to go through a more detailed review of an outline illustrating some of the issues, and then come back after getting your input with actual code language. So with that, I'll turn it over to Arthur to go through the presentation.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Thanks for framing that up for us, which is that the housing, and we're now calling it the Housing and Human Services element of the periodic plan, is what we're really discussing this evening, and the accessory dwelling units is part of that. So, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Art, before we go ahead, just kind of calibrate us as to how long you think this presentation is going to take.
So it's intended to be a conversation presentation. The presentation part, which is showing you some examples, is maybe 10 or so minutes, but I'm also going to ask you to jump in with any comments or thoughts as we're going through the pictures. And then it's a matter of kind of going through the items outlined in the packet and providing you a chance to discuss. So depending on how much comment you have, that will pretty much dictate the length. Could be an hour or less, could be longer depending on how many questions you have.
Fair enough. So about 10 minutes for the presentation as far as it's prepared, but then based on questions and input for us, it'll
We're
potentially go
hoping
longer.
to guide you through a conversation around key issues.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, we ready to start now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'm going to go to the podium then. So as I just sort of touched upon, what we want to try to do is first show you some pictures and different configurations that we have seen done for accessory dwelling units around different communities in East King County, just to sort of help get your brain thinking and sort of visually showing you some ideas. Please feel free to jump in at any point and ask questions. We may not be able to answer all the details, but this gives an idea to just start free flowing. Then what we want to do is we want to start taking all those kind of comments, and now let's hone in on several different main theme areas. One is sort of general issues related to what's allowed. Second is more design related. And then the third area is sort of permitting and kinds of process along those areas. And so we have a series in your packet of about 4 or 5 issues under each one of those. Sometimes we are presenting you sort of clear what we as staff, we've been working with Gary and David, and our staff have been sort of looking and has sort of proposals for you that sometimes need some tweaking, and we have some options. Other times we've given you in a couple topic areas a couple different approaches because there's so much variety. We wanted to let you sort of help guide us before we try to start drafting language. Then the idea, hopefully the goal for tonight is to get through that enough that we're prepared, all of us, the team, to sort of work on actually modifying the code language. We decided to take this approach rather than just come to you with code language because I found in the past just talking through issues in sort of general in those three categories has worked pretty well, and your code isn't quite organized that way, so we would have been doing a lot of jumping around. But we have included in here almost all the language that is in your existing code, so as we're looking at the different options, you'll be able to tell what's in there now. And if you want to actually see the code, we can call that up, so if you want to refer back to that. But our goal for tonight is to get to a point where we feel like we have your input and we have the basic concepts all down, and then it's a matter of writing it, and then it'll be more of a wordsmithing discussion next go around rather than basic concept issues. Okay? All right? So, any questions on that before we sort of jump in? Okay, so what we want to do is just show you examples of ways accessory dwelling units that we know have been created. The first couple pictures are basically examples of daylight basements. So in the picture on the left, you see, you can actually, if you look hard, see the door on the left-hand side of the building on the lower level. So that lower level has been essentially configured into an accessory dwelling unit. And in the example on the right, the accessory dwelling unit, you're really almost on the back side of the house, the one on the right, and so you're almost looking from the backyard into sort of the entrance on the lower level of an accessory dwelling unit. Okay? So those are examples. No real changes done to the exterior of the home. And in fact, probably in both those cases, doors and everything were already probably in place. So very little change to the exterior to create these units. Okay? This is another example of a daylight basement, and we have a little more information that sort of shows you. And the reason we have the data that's on this slide is that one of the issues we're going to raise or ask you about is when you limit the size of the home, sometimes the question is, of the accessory dwelling unit, we're going to have some language, but we're going to have some, quote, exception language for you to consider. And the idea is, especially for like daylight basements, is that the daylight basement, and just remember that number, is 44% of the total living area. And the question that sort of comes up is, wow, are you going to make them cut, if you limit area to a percentage of the total living area for the ADU, are you going to make, in this example, them cut off this little square footage here so that they keep under the limit? And so that's the reason, and this is a great example of the issue that we're going to bring back to you. Again, here's the main house, and you can see it's not a really large house. And that's one thing I would point out is, and I have a slide of a home in Everett that you couldn't even figure out how did they get an ADU in here. It looks like it's barely a tiny single-family home. So I think one thing to understand is that you don't have to always have large homes, but you can also, you're going to see in a minute, some very large homes with ADUs, and that gets into some of the other points that were raised. But you can see a very basic home, but it's on a hillside, and the accessory dwelling unit is on the downhill side from the house. Here's some other examples, not necessarily of where they're daylight basements, but just a couple other examples. Here's sort of a house that sort of had an addition on the end of the house, and they were able to put the ADU in that configuration so that the entrance is on the side of the main house. Here's another one that I'm not even exactly sure where the entrance to the ADU is on this one. But we do know this is a house that has an ADU, and I think what happens is you have to actually go around the back side completely of the house to get to it. But just another example that I could show you slides of several houses like this in Bellevue where it's like, there's an ADU here? I don't even quite know where exactly it is. Okay? So then other ones are seeing it within the main home. So these are all examples of when the ADU is within the main house. And as you can see, most of those that we showed you, you got the existing footprint, no significant changes to the existing footprint. Here's an example of, and we've seen this probably most commonly on Mercer Island, where they are being incorporated into new construction homes. Now here's an example This is the main house, and here is the accessory dwelling unit. And you can see they've actually turned the door here. And again, this may help give some illustrations of concept of entryway and how you allow design of the entryway. And you'll see that's a specific topic area that we'll bring up in a minute or in a few minutes when we get there. But again, this is a new construction house, so the ADU was planned as part of the home when they built it. Here's an example of within the main house as part of a major remodel. This is in Kirkland, and in this case, the main house has a great view out to the lake. This is in the sort of west of Market, not quite west of Market area of Kirkland. And so the main living area is in here, and here is the garage, and they created an entryway with an accessory dwelling unit as part of the major remodel above the garage. And so this is not a detached garage. It's just a single large, well, it's not that large of a home, but it's in that area of Kirkland where there are those smaller lots in the south of Market. This is actually just up the hill of the Market, south of Market area, or west of Market, sorry. So there's an example of an accessory dwelling unit done as part of a remodel. Now, this was one that David found, and I found this is a really intriguing one. Here is a house, and I think this illustrates, I think, a key concept. This is, you can barely tell, this is like the original house here, okay?
Well,
and
actually, where you were pointing first, where the light is, it's a tiny little
right here, right?
house,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Well,
You can see the house, there's the door, and this was probably like a 1,100 square foot home.
Oh, no, more like 6.
A 6, okay, even smaller, a small home. And this is the addition. And so essentially, the accessory dwelling unit is what was the main home. And the addition has now become the main, is the primary house. And the point to sort of point out here is when we start talking about additions and stuff, is we've seen some cities who say limit the size of an addition for an ADU. And you go, well, is there anything that prevents anyone from limiting the size of an addition on their home in general so long as it fits in the footprint? So why are you, so they could go in and do it and then 2 years later come back and say, I want an ADU. So one thing we often ask people to think is, what are you allowed to do with the physical form of a house? And so to what extent do you need to limit? And that's where things like entryway or matching style might be relevant. But envelope, they can pretty much do that anyway. So that's something to think about. And I actually have some slides I used to take where I have pictures of really nice remodels and some god-awful ugly remodels. And the god-awful ugly ones aren't ADUs. They're just god-awful ugly, additions, which people can do and do. So that's one thing to keep in mind is how do you regulate general remodels of homes in general absent ADUs? And so how much different do you make it for an ADU? And that's, not necessarily a single right answer, but a consideration. So now let's switch to other things other than within the main house. Probably what is most common is not to do a freestanding accessory dwelling unit, but rather something like where you're taking a detached garage and adding this floor space or already having the floor space and a detached garage. So here is a house that these two homes are actually almost across the street from one another. This is around the City Hall area of Kirkland. And as they did some major remodels, they took the old garage floor print, and I can't remember, I think one of these was actually a brand new garage, and in the other one, I think this one, it was a pretty major remodel. But basically, they created, as part of a major remodel of the primary house, they then also created the space above garages that are detached garages. Okay? And as you can see, using pitches and dormers and things along those lines is pretty common. I point that out because there's a couple different approaches when you start doing this. One is, you can see here, they pretty much have the same pitch as the roof, and so they need dormers in order to create living space within them. Here's another example of sort of a new garage built as part of a major remodel, and because of the hillside, the way they did it is the garage is here, and then they built the ADU right up above, on top of the garage area. Now, these are situations where the garage, the basic garage probably already, or in one case we know it already existed in 2 cases, but in most of these cases probably the garage was already there, and they did additions to a garage area. And so here, pretty clearly, these were added on. And in this third one, they didn't even add on. They just took that space, and I don't think there's a dormer on either side. You can see they did put in some dormer windows, sort of the Velux kind of skylight windows in here. So in one case, they changed nothing to the garage. They just fixed up the space. And in 2 others, they clearly did some addition to the garage. And I sort of point that out sort of as an example of, look at this roof pitch here versus like the roof pitch here and the roofs and the slope of how much vertical wall there is in each of these different illustrated cases here. And so here's like an example where they have that, but then on the back side, they took the pitch roof all the way down. Okay? So just different examples of ways garages have been used to do that. And then finally, detached, completely detached units that the only physical space is the ADU. And so here, we didn't quite get the picture, but they really tried to mimic the design of the main house here. This one, it's a larger property, and it's actually fair. When we looked at the assessor's information, it's a very large lot, and we couldn't even find pictures of the main house, so we're not quite sure how that design configuration went with it. But you see, obviously, very modern kind of space, but examples of that. I would say, from my experience of seeing the creation of affordable units, I've shown them to you in the proportion that you will see them done in your communities. Generally, people will try to do them within their main home. Secondarily, they'll try to do it kind of in a garage. And third will be this. We, about 10 years ago, hired architects to sort of look at different ways of creating ADUs and what the cost of the homeowners would be. And basically, that order is a cost. As you go along that spectrum I just described, the cost of creating the ADU goes up with each one of those. And so often, ADUs are often done as a family issue related. And so, again, when you look at the economics of ADU rents and what they generate, to build something new or whatever is a pretty difficult. You have foundations, the whole building, versus just taking space you already have and reconfiguring it, or taking a garage and sort of using that space where you got the foundation and it's just sort of pop up some walls and things. So we generally find that that's the order in which you see things. If there's sort of an exception to that, it was probably Kirkland. And that's because in Kirkland, and we won't be facing that issue here, there is a special circumstance going on in Kirkland. I'll keep it short at this moment, and that is they control size of single-family homes with FAR, so floor area ratio, so like you see in some commercial areas. And they provided some exception for ADUs. They allow you to go above that number, or at least they used to. So people were using ADUs as a way to create more living space than you can normally get on your property. So that's one reason why in Kirkland you might see more above the garage detached and things, because if it was part of the main house, you don't get that bonus. It's when it's as an auxiliary, you get the exception. So that's something they realized. They did some tweaking to their program. Okay, so those are meant to sort of give you any sort of oversight or quick overview of types of ADUs. Any questions or comments on that before we sort of shift over to the issues?
Art, does an ADU have to have like an additional bathroom or kitchen or anything else? What actually is an ADU? I mean, I know it's a remodel, but
and actually you'll see we have a definition. It has to be a complete living unit, which means it needs to. I would say the main defining element is in terms of space, sleeping, eating, food preparation, and bathroom. So you have to have that. In addition, if it is part of a main house, there needs to be fire separation between the 2 units. Okay, so that's the core of it.
So I was thinking about what the distinction is between a primary residence with an ADU and a duplex.
Yeah.
And so I have one, and that is that a duplex would have 2 different utility services. And I read in our notes that in this case, an ADU would really have one, even though you've made this addition. And are there other distinctions between the 2?
So there's legal distinctions and there's in-your-head distinctions. For legal distinctions, I guess sometimes people would say the ability to legally separate, so that you could have two separate owners. So you'll see in the language we have here, you can't have two separate owners. The utility issue sort of links to that, and that's one reason we put it out there. We put the utility issue out there, and we'll come back to it for two reasons. One is for that, to distinguish it from potentially what some people think of as duplex, which is two separate units, legally separate units, in terms of ownership potentially. The second is it costs a lot to do utility hookups in this region now, and so it makes a very exorbitant cost. And so one, it's trying to keep costs reasonable for the homeowner, but the second is it helps to say, guess what? You can't. Even if you found some wrinkle around the rules that we've written, by only having one utility hookup, you can't create separate ownership. Okay. Now, from the brain point of view, I think that's almost more design related, where people think of it. What do you think? Okay, tell me what you think of when you think of a duplex. Let me turn the question on you.
Well, the classic duplex is, you kind of see it from the front, you see two garages kind of together, they may share a single wall, then there's an entrance on one side and an entrance on the other. I'm trying to think, they may even have two separate addresses. I'm not sure if that's true. They might.
They always will. In fact,
Yeah.
a lot of ADUs will have separate address too, even.
Okay.
So
Now,
it's
as
not-
far as the title, though, when you purchase a duplex, it's still got one title, right? It's not two.
It can be either or. It can go either way.
All right.
That's why I sort of hesitated on
Yeah.
the separate ownership. Some are not. And they can literally be, there's different forms of separate ownership. You can have a condominium, one piece of land with two different owners. You can have literally duplexes in which they each own their piece of property
Yeah.
as well. So
Yeah, that's right. We actually covered that earlier in our agenda, last year. Yeah.
And then the other major distinction that every accessory dwelling unit code that I've seen has is that with an accessory dwelling unit, one of the units has to be owner occupied.
Right.
That's
Right.
that's probably the primary distinction between a
right.
duplex.
So that's going to be the first question we ask you, and that can be another defining distinguishment, is duplexes. In any of those forms of ownership, there's nothing that prevents the units from being rented. And so very often you'll see they are designed almost to be an investment kind of thing. So that's why that's one of the first reasons we put that in, that issue, is that doesn't have to be what a duplex is, doesn't have to be rental, but often people interpret and think that duplexes become rentals. And that's often where some of the concern comes from.
Commissioner Clark.
Of an attached ADU where they're either dealing with the existing space of the house or making an addition, what would be the owner's motivation for actually getting a permit for that ADU as opposed to just, particularly in the situation where thought it was on. What would be the motivation for the owner to go into the city, particularly in the case of where there's not an addition required,
Right.
but they're just going to simply improve the existing space as an ADU?
So that's where I guess the main is, and that's why a lot of people say there's a lot out there that are known. From the owner's point of view, the potential value, and it's sort of an emerging thing, but it's been emerging for a very long time, and it will change over time in communities, is being able to prove it's legal. And being able to prove it's legal, you might, well, what do I care? I don't need a lot of money, everything. When you want to go to sell the home, you can put it on the market saying, I have a legal ADU. There are times when that doesn't mean anything, but the town I lived in California, where they had legalized them, and I lived on a hillside, and everybody, they were in there. You'll often, in fact, read ads sometimes when you'll say pre-plumbed for ADU. You'll see that even around here increasingly. Pre-plumbed, ready to go, is an ADU. And the town I lived in, especially the California Bay Area, getting pretty expensive, and they were great nanny units. Okay, I knew many people who owned them. I owned one myself. I lived in one. Often the story was it was the nanny, it was the house, it helped out there. So one, being able to be legal, so that when you go to sell it, you can say, I've got a legal ADU. The other, and then that can potentially ripple in some cases into the financing. So when you're going, a bank may you can show to a bank, it is legal, I have this, and some lenders will recognize the income. So my first home I bought, that income from the ADU made it so I could afford the home. And the bank actually accounted for that. I can't say they all do that, it's universal, but so those are two motivations and potential reasons why.
It seems like if we're trying to encourage people to do it legally, that it'd be good to have that, I don't know, have a pamphlet or something at the city that kind of called those things out so that it motivated people to do that. The other question I have is, almost every house has more than one bathroom and more than one living space per se. In other words, a basement always has, or typically has, a bedroom and a bathroom. What is it that, does the fact that it also has an area for preparing food make it an ADU, or does it have to be, the intent be to occupy it separately for it to be an ADU?
Right, you need to be able to show physically separate units. That's where I was talking about the fire separation. So you have to have 2 kitchens, okay, and 2 bathrooms, and they have to be configured in a way that they have separate entrances, okay? So you need to be able to enter each unit separately with fire separation and have those 3 elements of both living units.
So if you had a house that had 2 kitchens, 2 food preparation areas, it could be that way without being an ADU, and somebody could still rent it out to somebody legally?
No.
Yeah, jump right.
No, okay.
No, we would view, if it was actually set up as an independent living space, we would say that's an independent living space.
But if it were just a daylight basement like a lot of ADUs
Right.
is that something they would
People
have
can
to-
rent out space in their homes.
Okay.
You can do that.
Okay.
But having 2 kitchens is typically not, it's sort of a weird scenario, but if you don't, so yeah, people can rent out rooms in their houses, but you don't have that physical legal separation. So that's another element of ADUs is, some people go, I look at it, my oldest daughter is come home in the summer, and it'd be kind of nice if I could have her in the home, but maybe where I don't have to worry about, let her have her own space to be in. So the distinguishing element is, yes, people can rent out rooms, and this is not dealing with that. And you may have a house set up so they're very separate ability to live and not have to cross paths very often. But when you go to the step of being an ADU, they are clearly distinguished units, and with that fire separation, so that means you got there is no passageway that goes before it. Now, some people can make their ADUs literally by taking, if you have that daylight basement, if you put a fire-rated door at the bottom or top of that staircase, you can be pretty darn close to being there. So sometimes it takes very little. We helped do a workshop a long time ago with the state, and one of the sessions we had is, so what kind of homes does it work in? And we were literally, my staff person went down to the architecture library and got books of home designs from the 60s and the 50s and the 70s. And we made overheads. And we had an architect who used to design these with no prep at all. And we had 2 different sessions during the day. So we had 15 slides for each presentation, or 10 for each one. And the architect simultaneously, we put it up there, and he'd say, this is how I do it in this home. This is how I would do it in this home. This is how, and almost every home, he was able to show with minor readjusting, was able to take those 2 bathrooms and this and create an ADU out of them. And it was amazing how quickly and easily he was able to do it with almost any form of home you could think of. Ranch-style homes, but a lot of the daylight basements and split levels, those are easy.
Yeah.
But he did it even with ones that didn't seem so obvious.
You guys are talking like it's desirable to have your home called an ADU, but it seems like that may not be the case.
Right.
I'm a little confused because you clearly are talking about some advantages and saying,
Right.
But I'm coming from the angle that based on what I read and what I've heard is that a lot of people want to have an ADU without really having to call it an ADU.
Right.
Which one do you find to be true?
I don't know, but I would say Okay, jump in.
Oh, well, in Bothell, I think there are people that want to have an ADU and may want to even do it legally, but find the restrictions too severe. So they just go ahead and do it and know that it's unlikely that a neighbor is going to complain, and we'll go out and inspect and say, no, this you have to come in and get a permit. So. So we're not, and all of the homes that we've shown you have one unit that's an ADU and one that's the primary residence. So the entire home doesn't become an ADU. So I think the main benefit, or one of the main benefits, is just providing another option for housing for the potential person living in the ADU, which may be the homeowner. So it gives first-time home buyers an opportunity to get into a home and have some rental income. It has, of course, the traditional thing of having a family member come and live, help raising the kids, or a nanny, as Arthur mentioned. And then at the other end of the spectrum, seniors who are downsizing. If they have an ADU, they might move into the ADU and rent out the larger house, if that was legal. It's not currently in Bothell, so.
Right. There's probably as many stories about why they're created. The ones that I had personal relationships with, one was to be there for the elderly woman in case something happened and they needed something. Another one was, the one I owned was first built by the parent for a son coming back from the war and needed a place for him to live, and he didn't have a lot of money. And then others were created because they had a parent they were worried in a few years, and so since they were doing the remodel, they wanted to be able to have it set up that they could either have her be part of the household, or if not, she could be in her own unit, either way. And I have several stories of those, of where that arrangement, and so it becomes an option for how to accommodate that. Okay, and I suspect as much. Sometimes people don't do it because they're worried if they say it's an ADU, then do you have the permit for it, and triggering all that. And so this is a way of saying we give you that choice on how to go about doing it, so long as you keep within whatever parameters that we're talking about this evening.
We're just going to jump in and do a time check. We're at about 30 minutes, and so what I'd like to just kind of ask us to do is kind of wrap up the overview background part of it. If there's some burning questions, let's do it now. If not, what I'd like us to do is move to kind of what we really, ADUs are allowed in Bothell today.
Right.
And I don't think there's any proposal to change that. So what I'd like to do is move to the language changes, both in our plan as well as our code. And which areas of that do we think we need to focus on and provide some guidance here? So are we ready to move to that? I think we are.
And I think we've touched on them all a lot. So as I mentioned earlier, this is sort of a formatting thing. So in your document, the rose-colored text is showing you the current language. In one case, we did a red line, and I think that was for a definition. And then the others where we said, we gave you the language, but we need you to say, do you want it to be 40%, 800 square feet, 1,000? We sort of put those in gray. So that's just sort of a format to help you as we go through this. So the first area is general uses issues, and so this would be in your packet. The language that is on page 1, I guess, of the attachment. And we basically have, these are the topic areas that are addressed. So I just wanted to go through each one of those and let us talk about each one of them. So the first area is sort of general, and it says they are permitted in all zones in which single-family homes are permitted. Okay? And then we also say 1 ADU per parcel, and then shall not be subdivided or otherwise segregated in ownership from the primary single dwelling unit. So those are all things we touched on. Here's language that, or close to kind of language that would address those. Any questions or comments about that agreement, that should be in there? Okay, we can.
So let me just see if I make sure I'm reading this correctly. So we're talking about general right now, correct?
Yes.
And so the language that says accessory dwelling units are permitted in all zones, et cetera, those two paragraphs, that's existing language right now that we have in our code?
This is not language exactly like this that's in your code now, okay? So this would be providing us, so some of our comments are, the intent sort of feels like it's there, but we want to make it, does the code need that clarification so that it's clear to everybody the intent?
So before we kind of go line by line, I just want to make sure I understand. What's currently in the Bothell Code now?
So in the current code, let me get to that.
The red rose
The
colored.
definition, the one that's the definition there. You
Right.
currently don't really have anything that's that general statement. You
Right,
just-
so what you're doing is you're proposing
Right,
that this additional language under general be added.
exactly.
Okay,
Yes.
all right, thank you.
And actually, the use table does essentially do the first, it doesn't put it in this language, but it does allow accessory units in all residential zones. And so this is just kind of stating what that
So what we're proposing is, in some cases here, like I said, right, it's not, most cities have it as language. In your case, it's in a chart. That's why we sort of said, let's put the word, and if you like it, we'll go back and look at the code, and if it's in the chart, we might come back and say, this issue was covered this way in your current language, or here's the very specific change from what you have today. For the most part, for many of these, we're showing you what's in there today so you can see it. But what we're really trying to do is tell us that this feels like the right stuff, and then we'll come back and show you how we have to modify language to get there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay? So that's the first one. The second one is related to owner occupancy, and we actually have two parts here. One is clarifying either the principal dwelling unit or the accessory dwelling unit must be occupied by an owner of the property or an immediate family member of the property owner. The parentheses in the back, MI, means that's a Mercer Island language. We sort of picked and choose from different ones. And then you do have a definition of owner occupancy, and we have come up, I think more city staff have come up with potential, this is where the red line is, of a modification of owner occupancy. I don't think it's a huge intent change, but it's something that provides a little more clarity in terms of what that might mean. So that's the owner occupancy issue. One, clarifying it can be either unit, and the other key issue is it can be an immediate family member as well as the person legally on title.
So there are a number of issues embedded in these two different approaches. In the Mercer Island case, it gives you the option of having the owner-occupied unit be either the primary unit or the accessory unit. And then it also gives the option that the one unit can be an actual owner or a family member of an owner. So you could own a house, have one of your children move into that house without putting them on the deed, but still meet the owner occupancy requirement. What I've done in the current Bothell definition of owner occupancy, a lot of it was just cleaning up really awkward language there. But there are a couple of more substantive changes there. One of which is to also show how we could allow either unit to be the owner-occupied unit. And then we do have this limitation that the owner must occupy the unit for at least 6 months of the calendar year and may not receive rent for the owner-occupied unit at any time during the year. That raised a question of if you had an owner-occupant that was a snowbird, went south for 4 or 5 months of the year and wanted to rent out, do a vacation rental or some other rental arrangement, is that something that that the commission thinks is reasonable, should be allowed, or should we leave the language as it is?
I think we've got some comments in that. Commissioner Clark.
I guess my my feedback on that is, I don't see why not, and why you wouldn't allow that to happen. But I do recall some discussion about one of the reasons you want to have an owner living there is that it encourages that the property will be well maintained and taken care of. So,
Right.
I'm not. Maybe you guys have some insight into how important that is to have
So-
the owner there.
So I would say this is an area of creating comfort for the broader community. By having one unit, if you don't want that owner to rent out, if the biggest concern is a duplex is 2 rental units in a neighborhood in which there is nobody impacted other than the neighbors by the bad behavior of renters, people have that perspective, then by saying you can't rent it out, you can have a family member there, but if you're not there, you can only rent 1 unit at a time. Well, anyone can rent their home, So, and the idea of having owner occupancy and encouraging that is, okay, so if you have a renter who makes a lot of noise, who's living with it more than anybody, kind of thing. So not only is it about maintaining the property, it's about living with the impact of that, quote, renter on the property and being more sensitive and taking care of the issues associated with having a renter, if people see that as a negative.
So I guess I'll just say that I would be in favor of the language. Actually, I would rather be able to see that they could receive rent for that, but I'm okay with the 6-month limitation. But the ability to receive rent. I also, again, I'm not really sure how this all fits together. But the bullet point before that, where it describes immediate family member, does that need to be defined, or is that an obvious definition that includes parents and kids, or does it include grandparents and aunts and uncles, or how does that work?
I think we'll need to have to research that and see if I would assume it may be already in the code, but we'll double check. So I heard one suggestion. Oh, I'm sorry.
Commissioner Cape.
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Clark. If we have to add the 6 months, that's fine. I think we're sort of getting into semantics, because when we go down to the current Bothell Code definition, someone could rent their house to 8 unrelated people. And, in a legal ADU unit, we're forcing them to be there. It just seems like, I don't know if that's 100% necessary. I agree it would give the community some added comfort knowing that they're going to maintain their home, but I just want to see what you guys thought. I don't see the large difference between the two.
Commissioner Stedman.
I would have no problem with a homeowner being able to rent out a portion of their home for 6 months if they were, for example, a snowbird and they rented it out to their son or their son's family or whatever. I think that would be a reasonable.
So you're saying the immediate family member
Yep.
stays in, and then and rent for up to 6 months of the year. Immediate family member all the time,
So there's a dwelling unit,
right?
and then I, as a homeowner, I'm in my home for 6 months.
Right.
6 months of the year, I go down to Arizona. But my son and his family come in and they stay in my home
Right, the main
for
house.
6 months, and they pay rent
Right,
to me as opposed to ABC apartment community.
right. So what I'm saying is, so you want the immediate family owner or immediate family members all the time
Yes.
for the main unit,
Yes.
or the owner-occupied
Or-
unit,
yeah,
the
right.
owner-occupied unit, and then of that, they can rent for up to 6 months.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that what, all head nodding there, for us to draft language around? You can obviously, when you see the language.
I guess the only thing, I'm fine with them, the owner being allowed to rent. So from that standpoint, to receive rent for it for 6 months is fine with me. This whole issue around defining the family, defining immediate family, et cetera, to me, it's like, maybe that's what the ADU was initially built for, but let's be real. The house will get sold, and then they'll be renting it to someone they don't know that person, or maybe it's a friend, it's not the immediate family member.
So, to clarify, the ADU does not have the immediate family member requirement. That's only for the owner-occupied unit.
Got it. Okay.
So,
All right.
just to make sure that that's clear.
All right.
Okay?
But I'm hearing at least two of you saying that even that owner-occupied unit could be rented out to
To
a
a family
non-family
member.
member
For a
for
family
To a
member
family
for
member.
up
Yeah.
to 6 months.
well,
I don't agree. That's not what I meant.
Okay.
I don't understand why we would restrict it to only family members to rent, because I think it's probably pretty impractical that a family member would come rent it unless they were already living there. I don't see that case happening. So maybe I misunderstood what you said.
Well, I think the intent is to make sure that there is, and I agree with this, to make sure that there is a representative of the owner, a family member, either the owner or a family member on the property at all times, because that does help ensure that the partying or whatever is kept to a minimum.
But it doesn't require that the house could be vacant. There's nothing that says that when the owner's gone for 6 months that the house couldn't be vacant. I mean, that would be
true.
so there wouldn't be anybody
Right.
there to keep an eye on it. So I'm not sure why we would restrict it to family members. I think, and frankly, if it's looked at as a money generating enterprise for an owner, I think you'd be better off having them be able to rent it to anybody.
So I'm going to just play devil's advocate because I've heard the neighborhood concern sign, so I'm just putting it out there, and this is exactly what we're trying to do tonight. Let you think through some of these details. Is the thought, though, being, and you just used the word that I've heard, it's a business enterprise, okay? And we don't want something that's purely an all-business enterprise, okay? So that's the issue. Now, all of a sudden, letting them to rent to a non-family member, now you got 2 rental households with no family connection. Okay, that's the counterpoint to yours. I'm not
Yes. saying
saying I strongly endorse it. I just want to let you know that's kind of how we've heard it expressed in the past from concerned neighbors.
Okay.
Or in another way to look at it is having an owner occupant on the premises at least more than 6 months of the year. Is that enough to prevent the concerns about having both units, rental units, basically turning it into a duplex?
Commissioner Cape.
I know we'll get into it later, but really based on the size of the ADUs, I don't really see it being a large issue. I mean, the primary residence could be, 4,000 square feet, who knows, but I just want to go back to the point that you could have 8 people in any given house, regardless, unrelated, living in there. And here we're talking about maybe a 600, 800 square foot independent unit. I guess I don't necessarily see the difference of why we would force the owner occupancy in this case. But
If I understand, the homeowner can actually live in the smaller unit and then rent out the larger unit. So they could live in a 800 square foot ADU and then rent out the 4,000 square foot home to, for using your example.
Right. I'm just thinking of total impact to the community on a given piece of property. So I just don't see the difference between any house, even if you can break it up into 2 families.
And is there a significant difference between the owner being away for 6 months and having one unit be vacant and one occupied by a renter versus both being occupied by renters? Does that mean that they're more likely to get together and party and make noise? Or I don't.
Right. And so this is what I'm going to suggest is when we come, these are all really good points. Let you all sleep on it. We'll bring back the language and we'll keep that highlighted because what I think we have heard is the owner occupancy is good. Being away for 6 months is fine. And the only thing and renting may be fine. We're sort of stuck on who can rent. So let's bring it so that that's all there and it's easy to strike out after you've all had a chance to mull over everything you've heard from everyone else and kind of thing. So that's what I would suggest for tonight, if that works for you.
Just one comment, then I know we need to move on. So really kind of what we're looking at is either this Mercer Island language or a modification of our existing Bothell language.
No, what we're saying is the definition goes, they both go in.
They would both go in.
They both go in. Right, because you need the purpose of the second one is to define what owner occupancy means. So the first one is clearly stating one of the units, because for some people, we want to make it clear in the first one, the owner can be in either one of the units. They don't have to be in the main unit. So that's why we have the Mercer Island. Now, what does owner occupancy mean? And that's where the definition comes in. So we think you need both.
Okay.
Okay? So is that enough on that one for
Yep,
tonight?
I think that's enough for tonight.
Okay. Limitations on occupancy. And So here, Bellevue, you could either be silent on the issue completely. What Bellevue has done is sort of said, we want this is your point, Commissioner Cave, about you're allowed to have 8 unrelated individuals. So Bellevue sort of says from that definitional point of view, the whole property must meet that definition still. Okay, so you couldn't have 2 large groups of people in each unit, but combined, we want to measure occupancy on that definition for the whole property. Or you could be silent. Some cities are silent on it. We wanted to give you an example of where a city tried to make sure you didn't have 2 large, different, independent, that you couldn't have 16 unrelated individuals, basically, is what this is saying.
And you're saying that we currently have a code definition for family, and you've provided that language.
Exactly.
Right.
Right.
Any discussion on that?
Okay?
I think
All right.
I think at this point we'd
Great.
say leave it as is.
Okay,
Let's move
great.
on.
Do you want us to give you that language from Bellevue as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, now limitation on size. This is a potentially tricky one, and there's different issues related to size. So I'm going to give you the basics, and then these are all nuances on the basics. So the basic things to think about are, is there a physical size described in square footage limitation? Is there a physical size limitation based on the percentage of living area of the combined, both the ADU and the primary unit? Or is there a double? There's a both, not to exceed kind of thing. And then the second is, if you allow detached, is there a different way of thinking of size for the detached unit? Okay, so that's the basic issues. So in the first one, it's purely a square footage. All you're limiting is all you deal with is the size of the ADU, and you just put a square footage range. Okay, and so that's one approach. That's what the first box is about. The second box is doing the same thing, and then adds on top of that, but in no event more than 40% of the total living area of the combined ADU and primary unit. And then that's where we show you all the gray, where, first pick which approach you want to use, and then ask it, say, well, we don't like the gray. I mean, if I had a different square footage or a different percentage, I'd feel better about it. And let's see. And then the next one, it's only based on percentage. It's sort of percentage, and then with a not to exceed number. Okay, it's somewhat similar to the second one. So those are probably the basics, and then this is the discretion. The fourth box is that provision about saying give some discretion to the planning director to allow, if you do the percentage or even the square footage, to look at the actual home and say, my God, it's 44% because I do the daylight basement. They want to do the daylight basement. So that gives some discretion. And we put in there based on efficient use of all floor areas. So there is a sort of prescribing guidance to the planning director in making that decision. Okay? And then the next one is, do you do detached separate? Do you look at it as some cities have. Again, I think one reason Kirkland had to is, remember that FAR thing I was telling you about? And that's one reason why they felt a need to have they have a lot of language in their ordinance. If you start reading other ordinances, you're going to find they have a lot of language on detached and size and how to measure it. And it's because it relates to that FAR issue. So they had to be very, very clear. Most other cities have not done that. In fact, most cities don't have it, but we wanted to put it out there as a choice for you. Okay? And then the last one is the actual current Bothell Code, which we think has some dilemmas because it limits how much of an expansion you can do to 10% of the existing floor space, which we think is somewhat problematic. And also it seems to imply it can only be in an attached unit. So we are basically suggesting that what you have in your current code should be replaced by one of the boxes or combination of the boxes above.
So any feedback on kind of the primary questions around percent of primary dwelling unit, total size and square footage, and then a detached versus attached? Commissioner Stedman.
As a general rule, I think I like the idea of having two different code language sections for an attached and detached. I just think that makes more sense. I think well, I just think it makes a lot more sense. I think 10%. The current code is 10%, not to exceed the floor area by 10%. If you got a 2,400 square foot home, that's only a 240 square foot ADU, which is that's pretty darn small.
Actually, the 10% is referring to the increase in new construction. In other words, if you were but it's not referring to the total amount of this ADU square footage.
Right.
So the 10% is saying, okay, we've got a construction project going on here, and in this project, we're going to increase the total square footage of the primary unit. And the Bothell language is limiting that to 10%.
And that's what I'm saying. So if it's a 2,400 square foot home, then it would limit it to a 240 square foot ADU.
No.
Addition.
240 square foot addition.
Correct.
But the ADU could be 40%.
Or 600 feet,
600 square feet.
whichever is greater.
Yeah, you are correct. A 240
Right.
square foot addition. Right.
Correct.
Which I still look at as that's a pretty small addition.
Right.
A typical, studio apartment is typically 500 to 600 square feet, and that.
And well, the question is should we have any limitation on the increase at all? Do we even need that?
You brought up the question, it occurred to me as I was reading this earlier about, I think what you're saying was, if you're just putting an addition on your house, is there a specific limitation on the percent that you can increase the house by? Or is
That's a good question. Let's just take
No.
the ADU out of the picture.
Right,
and
yeah.
We're just going to do an addition to our house. Is there any limitation on that?
Only the limitation provided by the setbacks, lot coverage.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And
Exactly. But nothing in addition to that.
Right.
So that's why, to me, this 10% limitation on the additional, I don't get it.
agree.
No other
I think
city,
that
right.
I would agree.
No other city that I know of has that
I would
kind of
be-
limitation on
I
additions.
think we'd be for striking that whole limitation completely.
Yep.
Any other comments, Commissioner Stedman?
No, but thank you for clarifying that. That's exactly where I was going, was I think that 10% is arbitrary and
Sorry.
limits us.
Sorry to butt in.
No, that's fine.
Commissioner Cape.
I like the idea of having some discretion, like Kirkland. So if we set a max, if someone had a, 40 by 25 foot garage that they wanted to have an upper floor in, it'd be nice to have some wiggle room if it made sense. So the daylight basement exceeded the maximum.
Okay. And Kirkland's not the only city who's done that. Many of the cities have been doing that. Okay.
I think, just speaking personally here, so I'd be interested in knowing if my fellow commissioners agree with me or not, and that is that I lean towards a percent of the total square footage of the primary as the kind of main metric. This limitation, whether it's 600 square feet or 800 or 1,000 maximum and a 220 square foot minimum, I don't know, to me it just feels, it's like, where'd that number come from? And it just feels arbitrary to me. And so I frankly, I guess I'm just thinking out loud here, but this idea of just 40% of the primary dwelling unit could be the ADU. I'm wondering why we wouldn't just have that be the only
So,
limiting
Ms. Dore, I
factor.
want to be clear on how we measure the 40%. We suggest that the percentage be of whatever the total living area, the two combined. Because if you start, let's say you have a main, and you say if it's 40% of the main unit, and they use part of the main unit as the before or the after, so we say take all the living area for the two combined, and what's the percentage maximum that can be within the ADU. So what we're saying is that the max at 40% would be 60% in the main unit and 40%. So if you had a 1,000 square foot, just to keep the math simple, 600 square feet could be for the main unit with a maximum of 400 square feet for the ADU.
So let's be,
So if you convert garage space, then you have to include that as living space now. If you add an addition, you have to include that. It's when you take the two final products combined, no more than and you said 40%, can be as part of the ADU. Okay?
Well, is what you're describing an argument for keeping this square footage limitation of 600, 800,000, whatever?
That would lead towards, if, I would say, since you say, hey, let's have the percentage be the main guidance force, that would be the third box if you then want to say, but not to exceed. Okay? Kind of thing. Because if you had a small home, you still want to make sure it's an accessory unit, and that's why it's 40%, that's where the 40% comes from. It's smaller than the other unit, so that's another thing about duplexes. Duplexes are often, they're mirrors because they're identical. And here, no, you got a main unit and you've got a secondary unit. So that's where why a lot of cities pick the 40%. However, then you start thinking about how big some homes are, and do you want an accessory dwelling unit that could be 2,000 square feet or 1,800 square feet? If it's meant to be a way to help accommodate and affordability, et cetera, then, and I've seen numbers generally, when I first started doing this, it was like 600 square feet. And I'd say in the last 10 years, it's been more like 800 or 1,000 seem to be the maximums. And 800 to 1,000, you can easily do 2 bedrooms. Okay? Originally, cities were doing it more like 600 because they wanted them to be studios and 1 bedrooms. And you can do that with 600. 800 to 1,000, which is what we're seeing more and more of, that still allows a 2-bedroom unit to be comfortably designed around.
So I'm coming around to the idea of keeping the square footage limitation in as well as the percent, given that the overall purpose of this is affordable housing. I mean, if that's really one of the driving factors of this is affordable housing, so we're not trying to get to where we have 2,000 square foot, 1 primary, 1 ADU, and having a 2,000 or 1,800 square foot ADU. So I guess we're back to the idea that we would really need both metrics, both numbers. So I'm on board with them both being there. We can debate as to what that number ought to be. I don't think we have to even define that tonight.
Okay, so we'll come back with that, the percentage and the square footage shaded. I'll probably give you what we're seeing is most common recently, but we'll talk about that more.
Keep it as simple as possible. I mean,
I think that's why I think the third box is.
Yeah, right. The third is, and I know that was just for detached, but I mean, that third box is kind of reading to me the simplest. So,
okay.
All right.
Now, but I also heard earlier detach something different, and so let's come back to that one for a minute.
Commissioner Clark.
I want to just add one thing. If we're going to come back to the, you say we're not going to discuss the maximum square footage tonight? Is that?
That was my thought, was that we do not have to make a final call or recommendation on what that maximum square footage
My
would
only
be
comment
tonight.
is don't care about making a final one, but it does seem like Bothel's is small compared to, I mean, I look at all these other ones, you've got 800, 900, 1,000, and 800, and we're at 600. So I think.
So you'd like us to come back with something different than 600?
I think so. And then, let's see. And then I guess if you're going to limit the percentage, so you're on a smaller home, you could make a larger addition. Say you had a home that was 600 square feet, and you made a 2,000 square foot addition onto it. With that 40% number, you could be 40% of that resulting 2,600 square feet. So you could actually make quite a large ADU out of a very small home by putting a very large addition on it.
So that's the second or third slide. Then the old home becomes the ADU now,
Correct. Yeah. Right.
essentially. Because the ADU can only be 40% of that. Yeah, you could do a huge addition, but as you design it, it's got to be split into 2 living spaces, one that's 40% and one that's 60%, less than 40%.
Oh, and I guess you also have the maximum size limitation.
Right,
I keep forgetting
exactly.
that. So that would limit it to a maximum,
Exactly.
but it wouldn't limit the overall size of
No,
the
you
addition.
could then have, right. And that's why I thought that one slide was really good, because you can see they did exactly what you said, but they decided to just keep the old home as the ADU, essentially.
And then the only other thing I have is there any precedent for the size of the lot defining how big an ADU can be? Because I could see on a 1 acre lot that you might be able to justify having a larger ADU than you could on a.
So you want to hear an interesting twist to that story? And this is where your detached comes in, okay? Because you said you wanted to talk maybe, do we do the same for both? sometimes where the concern, and it comes up the most with detached, is in areas with large properties. And the logic there being, again, this is the neighbor concern issue, is, oh, they can put this thing far away from the main house and right next to my property, and I'm living with the impact, and they never have to live with it because they've got so much separation in space. So if anything, I'd almost say, again, if you're worried about neighborhood nervousness, that would be an argument actually against saying, oh, let them go larger because it's a bigger lot. Okay, again, and then also for the affordability issue. Oh, okay, so we have big homes here, and so the ADUs are also big, and so they're more expensive.
Okay.
And on the other side, small lots will limit the size to some extent just
Right.
because of the buildable area.
Right.
And, well, I'm not sure if this is the right time to bring this up, but we currently have a 5% of lot area limitation on accessory buildings.
Right.
So, which, unless we make an exception, that would apply to detached accessory dwellings. We do have an exception to that 5% rule to allow for two-car garages on smaller lots, but and we could apply that same exception to accessory dwelling units, but it's a 480 square foot maximum in that case. So that's another little twist that we have to deal with our code.
Right. So for that reason, that almost reinforces for your city why we should do something clear about detached because of this 5%, to somehow either say what we have is that third box applies universally or have a separate sentence about detached. And that's where if you want to ask us to have a separate sentence on detached limitation, and we could have the same sentence, and you could just then plug in different percentages, just say for attached it's this, and for detached it's that. And if in the end you end up with the same numbers, then you
Let's just do a real quick vote on separate language for attached versus detached. Commissioner Clark, would you agree with that we want to have separate language for attached and detached?
I don't frankly see a reason for that.
Commissioner Stedman?
As far as limitation on size, I say no. As far as
No.
design, I say yes.
But just on whether we would want to have language for detached ADUs and then separate language for detached, attached versus detached.
Yes.
Commissioner Cabe.
Yes, just because I'd want to go with percentage on attached and have the cap on detached. That's
Yep.
just sort of what-
And me too. I think we should have separate language for attached and detached.
Okay.
And, it may be different, maybe, but I think it will end up being different. But
Okay.
So, yes.
all right, we will do that. Okay.
From a procedural standpoint, it's kind of a time check. We're at about an hour into this topic. We've had basically our overall overview. We've had good discussion on general use as well as size limitations. I see we've got two more in front of us: design issues and
Right.
permitting and enforcement.
Yes.
I'm gonna suggest that we carry those issues forward to a future meeting. And I just want to I think we've had a really great overview. I think this has been good, but I don't want our energy to kind of wane, and I think it could be at this point.
Okay.
So, Dave, I don't know if we could look at the calendar and see, or if we have to make that determination now, but my feeling is that I think we're going to go for another hour on these last two, and I want to give it the time it deserves, but I don't know if we really should do it this evening.
We don't need to continue this item to a date certain. We do need to continue the overall public hearing on the periodic plan and code update to October 1st, and then we can look at the calendar and find a date. We were going to have to bring it back to you anyway, but we can schedule that. It'll be at some date after October 1st.
Right. So I think what I'd like to ask staff to do is come back to us reflecting kind of the input that we provided with you thus far. And we'll be prepared to kind of crisply go through design issues as well as permitting and enforcement. So we'll do some additional,
Okay.
and I think we're going to be much more informed in doing our reading now based on kind of this evening. But rather than just trying to kind of plow through this here for another hour, I think it would be better time spent and I think better input provided if we turn this into kind of two separate meetings. So
Okay.
I'm going to suggest that.
Okay.
So I'd like to hear, at this point, a motion that says, well, we would continue the public hearing for the 2015 periodic plan for the Housing Human Services element, specifically around ADUs, to move forward to a future date to be determined, sometime in October. I don't think we have a specific date on that right now.
Yeah, and you don't really need to do that as a motion.
All right.
The only thing we need to do is continue the overall public hearing on
Okay, so let me hear a motion to that effect of just continuing the periodic plan and code update.
to October 1st.
I motion that we continue the periodic plan and code update to October 1st. Is that the date?
Yes.
Is there a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Motion passes unanimously, and we'll move forward with our agenda. Any reports from staff?
I would just like to just point out that October 1st, you'll be hearing the first two sub-area plan updates. Brickyard Road is one, and I can't remember the other now, and it's not on the calendar here. But there are two that are fairly straightforward, not a lot of changes, so we feel that we can get through this fairly quickly, and then we'll also deal with the follow-up, the second review of the land use element, which was originally scheduled for next week, but we need that extra week to prepare for that. And I'd actually like to just clarify one thing. You may have said this and I missed it as I was making notes. You are ready for us next time to start bringing back some actual code language to consider?
For the ADUs?
For the ADUs?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, based on the input that you received from us today. Yeah.
Okay. And we'll take a shot at the other issues
Yes.
that we didn't get to as well. And then one other a report. It was in the email, but I wanted to make it public that City Council last night did appoint David Vliet to fill the empty seat on the Planning Commission, and he will be starting also on October 1st.
Excellent.
He was recently appointed to the Landmark Preservation Board, but his first choice was Planning Commission initially, so I think he'll be a good addition to the board.
Excellent. We'll look forward to him joining us. Any other reports from staff?
No.
One comment, looking through my notes, Commissioner Gastineau did inform me that he was not going to be here, so for this evening, let the record show he is absent and excused. At this point, is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn. Second.
We are adjourned.
Did you want to capture that with those additional?
Oh, yeah, totally.
So the computer is